Greetings, young historians. Welcome back to another episode of AP World History Fireside with Miss JJ. In this episode, we are on Chapter 23, Section 3 of The Earth and Its People, our AP World History textbook. And today we will be discussing the French Revolution. As the French say, Vive les révolutions, which means long live the revolution. As usual, I encourage you to take your own notes as we go along. The French Revolution, 1789 to 1850. So the dates automatically tell you this is not long after the American Revolution. The French Revolution undermined the traditional monarchy, as well as the power of the Catholic Church and the hereditary aristocracy. But, unlike the American Revolution, did not create an enduring form of representative democracy. The colonial revolution in North America, however, did not confront so directly the entrenched privileges of an established church, monarchy, and aristocracy. The American Revolution produced no symbolic drama comparable to the public beheading of the French king Louis XVI in early 1793. So what we see here is the American Revolution was really about government and representation, but in the French Revolution we're going to see a whole different set of themes that are about religion and aristocracy, and a lot of violence is going to be involved. And not in the form of war, but in the form of things like beheading. The guillotine comes into play. Among its achievements, the French Revolution expanded mass participation in political life and radicalized the democratic tradition inherited from English and American experiences. But in the end, the passions unleashed in France by revolutionary events could not be sustained, and popular demagogues and the dictatorship of Napoleon stalled democratic reform. So we're going to see in the end of the French Revolution that Napoleon comes into power, which keeps France from having the same democratic outcome that the United States had in their revolution with Great Britain. French society was divided into three groups. The clergy, called the First Estate, numbered about 130,000 in a nation of 28 million. The Catholic Church owned about 10% of the nation's land and extracted substantial amounts of wealth from the economy in the form of tithes and ecclesiastical fees. Despite its substantial wealth, the church was exempted from nearly all taxes. The clergy was organized hierarchically, and members of the hereditary nobility held almost all upper positions in the church. The 300,000 members of the nobility, who are called the Second Estate, controlled about 30% of the land and retained ancient rights on much of the rest. Nobles held the vast majority of high administrative, judicial, military, and church positions. So your financial status is directly related to your position in the church. Though traditionally barred from some types of commercial activity, nobles were important participants in wholesale trading, banking, manufacturing, and mining. Like the clergy, this estate was hierarchical. Important differences in wealth, power, and outlook separated the higher from the lower nobility. The nobility was also a highly permeable class. The Second Estate in the 18th century saw an enormous infusion of wealthy commoners who purchased administrative and judicial offices that conferred noble status. So people bought their way into nobility. The Third Estate included everyone else, from wealthy financier to homeless beggar. The bourgeoisie, or middle class, grew rapidly in the 18th century. There were 3 times as many members of this class in 1774, when Louis XVI took the throne, as there had been in 1715, at the end of Louis XIV, his father's, reign. Commerce, finance, and manufacturing accounted for much of the wealth of the Third Estate. Wealthy commoners also owned nearly a third of the nation's land. This literate and socially ambitious class supported an expanding publishing industry, subsidized the fine arts, and purchased many of the extravagant new homes being built in Paris and other cities. So you have a class of people who are promoting art and literature and are moving up in social status. Peasants accounted for 80% of the French population. That's a lot. Artisans and other skilled workers, small shopkeepers and peddlers, and small landowners held a more privileged position in society. They owned some property and lived decently when crops were good and prices were stable. By 1780, poor harvests had increased their cost of living and led to a decline in consumer demand for their products. They were rich enough to fear the loss of their property and status, well educated enough to be aware of the growing criticism of the king, but too poor and marginalized to influence policy. So these people own land, they make a decent living, but they don't have a status in society that can allow them to affect any decisions that the king is making. The nation's poor were a large, growing, and troublesome sector. The poverty and vulnerability of peasant families forced younger children to seek seasonal work away from home and led many to crime and beggary. That raids by roving vagabonds threatened isolated farms was one measure of this social dislocation. In Paris and other French cities, the vile living conditions and unhealthy diet of the working poor were startling to visitors from other European nations. Urban streets swarmed with beggars and prostitutes. Paris alone had 25,000 prostitutes in 1760. The wretchedness of the French poor is perhaps best indicated by the growing problem of child abandonment. On the eve of the French Revolution, at least 40,000 children a year were given up by their parents. The convenient fiction was that these children would be adopted, but in reality, most died of neglect. So people could not afford to keep their children and were giving them up. Unable to afford decent housing, obtain steady employment, or protect their children, the poor periodically erupted in violent protests and rage. In the countryside, violence was often the reaction when the nobility or clergy increased dues and fees. In towns and cities, increase in the price of bread often provided the spark for bread prices, largely determined the quality of life for the poor. The very famous, although false, attribution that Marie Antoinette said, "Let them eat cake," comes from this notion that they could not afford to buy bread, and French cake in that time was made flourless, so they should be able to afford cake, although Marie Antoinette never actually said that. These explosive episodes, however, were not revolutionary in character. The remedies sought were conventional and immediate, rather than structural and long-term. That was to change when the Crown tried to solve its fiscal crisis. The expenses of the War of Austrian Succession began the crisis. Louis XV first tried to impose new taxes on the nobility and on other groups that in the past had enjoyed exemptions. But this effort failed in the face of widespread protest and the refusal of the Parliament of Paris, a court of appeals that heard appeals from local courts throughout France, to register the new tax. So, they're being taxed to try to pay for this conflict with Austria, and this is causing people to be unhappy. The crisis deepened when debts from the 7 Years' War compelled the king to impose the emergency fiscal measures. Again, that's the French-Indian War in most American classrooms. Again, the king met resistance from the Parliament of Paris. In 1768, frustrated authorities exiled the members of that parliament and pushed through a series of unpopular fiscal measures. So when the Parliament wouldn't pass the king's agenda, they got rid of the people who were in Parliament and replaced them with people who would. When the 22-year-old Louis XVI assumed the throne in 1774, he attempted to gain popular support by recalling the exiled members of Parliament of Paris. But he soon learned that provincial parliaments had also come to see themselves as having a constitutional power to check any growth in monarchical authority. So he tries to make people happy by calling these members of Parliament back, but he's going to find out that these are people who are going to undermine his agenda, so that's not going to work out in his favor. In 1774, Louis' chief financial officer warned that the government could barely afford to operate. As he put it, the first gunshot act of war will drive the state to bankruptcy. So he's saying if we get into any kind of conflict, we are going to be beyond broke. Despite this warning, the French took on the heavy burden of supporting the American Revolution. Remember we talked earlier about that the French were both financing and sending troops to assist in the American Revolution, which, although counter to Louis XVI's form of government, helped him basically make headway against the British, his enemy. They delayed the collapse by borrowing enormous sums and disguising the growth in debt in misleading financial accounts. By the end of the war with Britain, more than half of France's national budget was required to service the debt alone. It soon became clear that fiscal reforms and new taxes, not loans, were necessary. In 1787, the desperate king called an assembly of notables to approve a radical and comprehensive reform of the economy and fiscal policy. Despite the fact that the members of this assembly were selected by the king's advisors from high nobility, the judiciary and the clergy, it proved unwilling to act as a rubber stamp for the proposed reforms or new taxes. So these people he calls in won't pass the measures that he wants to put in place to correct the economy. Instead, these representatives of France's most privileged classes sought to protect their own interests by questioning the competence of the king and his ministers to supervise the nation's affairs. In frustration, the king dismissed the notables and attempted to implement some reforms on his own. But his effort was met by an increasingly hostile judiciary and by popular demonstrations. Because the king was unable to extract the needed tax concessions from the French elite, he was forced to call the Estates General, which is the French national legislature, which had not met since 1614. The narrow self-interest and greed of the rich, who would not tolerate an increase in their taxes, rather than grinding poverty of the common people, had created the conditions for political revolution. In late 1788 and early 1789, members of the three estates came together throughout the nation to discuss grievances and elect representatives who would meet at Versailles. Versailles was Louis XVI's palace, and it is still there today. Many treaties have been signed there in the 20th century in the Hall of Mirrors. Cool place. I have some pictures of it in my room if you want to see them. The Third Estate's representatives were mostly men of property, but there was anger directed against the king's ministers, and an inclination to move France towards constitutional monarchy with an elected legislature. So here come these ideas about democracy. Many nobles and members of the clergy sympathized with the reform agenda of the Third Estate, but deep internal divisions over procedural and policy issues limited the power of the First and Second Estates. Traditionally, the three estates met separately, and a positive vote by two of the three was required for action. Tradition, however, was quickly overturned when the Third Estate refused to conduct business until the king ordered the other two estates to sit with it in a single body. So they're saying, we're not going to meet separately, we will all meet together. Try to deal with common interests. During a 6-week period of a stalemate, many parish priests from the First Estate began to meet with the commoners. When this expanded, the Third Estate declared itself the National Assembly. The king and his advisors recognized that the reformers intended to force them to accept a constitutional monarchy. So the king sees that these people have an agenda to basically make the king conform to a constitution. After being locked out of their meeting place, the Third Estate appropriated an indoor tennis court and pledged to write a constitution. The oath of the tennis court ended Louis's vain hope that he could limit the agenda of fiscal reform. So he locks them out of the room where they meet, and rather than let that stop them, they go meet on a tennis court and write their constitution. The king's effort to solve the nation's fiscal crisis was being connected in unpredictable ways to the central ideas of the era. People were sovereign, and the legitimacy of political institutions and individual rulers ultimately depended on their carrying out the people's will. You cannot govern me unless I give you permission to do so. There's that theme again. Louis prepared for a confrontation with the National Assembly by moving military forces to Versailles. But before he could act, the people of Paris intervened. A succession of bad harvests, beginning in 1785, had propelled bread prices upward throughout France and provoked an economic depression as demand for the non-essential goods collapsed. By the time the Estates General met, nearly a third of the Parisian workforce was unemployed. Hunger and anger marched hand in hand through working-class neighborhoods. When the people of Paris heard that the king was massing troops in Versailles to arrest the representatives, crowds of common people began to seize arms and mobilize. On July 14th, 1789, a crowd searching for military supplies attacked the Bastille. The Bastille was the French jail. A medieval fortress, the Bastille is a medieval fortress used as a prison. The futile defense of the Bastille cost 98 lives before its garrison surrendered. Enraged, the attackers hacked the commander to death and then paraded through the city with his head and that of Paris's chief magistrate stuck on sticks. So these people are furious. They're enraged. They're so mad that they cut the heads off of these two individuals and parade around the city with them. That's mad. These events coincided with uprisings by peasants in the country. Peasants sacked manor houses and destroyed documents that recorded their traditional obligations, their debts. They refused to pay taxes and dues to landowners and seized common lands. Forced to recognize the fury raging through rural areas, the National Assembly voted to end traditional obligations and reform the tax system. Having forced acceptance of their narrow agenda, the peasants ceased their revolt. Okay. These popular uprisings strengthened the hand of the National Assembly in its dealings with the king. One manifestation of this altered relationship was the passage of the Declaration of the Rights of Man. There were clear similarities in the language of this declaration and that of the U.S. Declaration of Independence. Indeed, Thomas Jefferson, who had written the American document and was a U.S. ambassador to Paris, and offered his opinion to those involved in drafting the French statement. The French Declaration, however, was more sweeping in its language than the American one. Among the enumerated rights were liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. The Declaration of Rights of Man also guaranteed free expression of ideas, equality before the law, and representative government. While delegates debated the political issues in Versailles, the economic crisis worsened in Paris. Versailles is, about an hour by car outside of Paris, so I guess a little longer than that. by horse and carriage, but it's not too far away. Women employed in the garment industry and in small-scale retail businesses were particularly hard hit because the working women of Paris faced high food prices every day as they struggled to feed their family. Their anger had a hard edge. Mad moms. Public markets became political arenas where the urban poor met daily in an angry assembly. Here, the revolutionary link between the material deprivation of the French poor and the political aspirations of the French bourgeois was forged. So you have people in Versailles living an extremely luxurious lifestyle, the nobility enjoying all of the finer things life has to offer, and lower classes and the middle class are not happy. On October 5th, market women organized a crowd of thousands to march the 12 miles to Versailles. Okay, so I guess Versailles is only 12 miles from Paris. Excuse me for my earlier error. The March to Versailles has a little segment on page 588 that I'm not going to read. So if you want to read about that, you'll have to do it yourself. Once there, they forced their way into the National Assembly to demand action from the frightened representatives. The point is that we want bread. The crowd then entered the royal apartments, which is where the king and his queen, Marie Antoinette, and all of their people reside. The crowd entered the royal apartments, killed some of the king's guards, and searched for Marie Antoinette, who they loathed as a symbol of extravagance. Eventually, the crowd demanded that the royal family return to Paris. They had run away and hid. Preceded by the heads of two aristocrats carried on pikes and hauling away the palace's supply of flour, the triumphant crowd escorted the royal family to Paris. The king's ability to resist democratic change overcome by the Paris crowd, the National Assembly achieved a radically restructured French society in the next 2 years. It passed a new constitution that dramatically limited monarchical power. Monarchical power. I cannot read. And abolished the nobility as a hereditary class. Economic reforms swept away monopolies and trade barriers within France. The Legislative Assembly, which was the new name for the National Assembly under the Constitution, seized church lands to use as collateral for new paper currency, and priests who were to be elected were put on state payroll. When the government tried to force priests to take loyalty oath, however, many Catholics joined a growing counter-revolutionary movement. At first, many European monarchs had welcomed the weakening French king, but by 1791, Austria and Prussia threatened to intervene in support of the monarchy. So, the neighbors at first are okay with weakening the king's powers, obviously for their own personal agenda. But eventually they start to realize this is getting kind of unruly, and they start to show support for the king. The Legislative Assembly responded by declaring war. Although the war went badly at first for French forces, people across France responded patriotically to foreign invasions, forming a huge new volunteer army and mobilizing national resources to meet the challenge. By the end of 1792, French armies had gained the upper hand everywhere, and these are essentially militias. In this period of national crisis and foreign threat, the French Revolution entered its most radical phase. A failed effort by the king and queen to escape from Paris and find foreign allies cost the king any remaining support. So the king and Marie Antoinette were being held in Paris, and they attempt, literally in the middle of the night, to flee. But before they can make it out of France, they are caught and brought back. And that is not going to end well for them at all. As foreign armies crossed into France, his behavior was increasingly viewed as treasonous. the governor not giving their consent. On August 10th, 1792, a crowd similar to the one that had marched on Versailles earlier invaded his palace in Paris and forced the king to seek protection in a legislative assembly. The assembly suspended the king, ordered his imprisonment, and called for the formation of a new national convention to be elected by the vote of all men. Rumors of a counter-revolutionary plot kept working-class neighborhoods in an uproar. In September, mobs surged through the city's prisons, killing nearly half the prisoners. Swept along by popular passion, the newly elected National Convention convicted Louis XIV of treason and sentenced him to death, and proclaimed France a republic. So because the king would not consent to the will of the governed, they declared him a traitor of France and sentenced him to death. The guillotine ended the king's life in January of 1793. Invented in the spirit of the era as a more humane way to execute the condemned, this machine was to become a bloody symbol of the revolution. The National Convention, the new legislature of the First Republic, convened in September. Almost all of its members were from the middle class, and nearly all were Jacobins. Jacobins are very uncompromising Democrats. They're very spirited in their desire for democracy, and if they have to cut your head off to get it, they will. Deep political differences, however, separated moderate Jacobins, called the Girondists, after a region in southern France, and radicals known as the Mountain. Members of the Mountain, so named because their seats were on the highest level of the assembly hall, were more sympathetic than the Girondists to the demands of the Parisian working class, and were more impatient with parliamentary procedure and constitutional constraints on government action. The Mountain came to be dominated by a man whose name is Maximilien Robespierre, a young, little-known lawyer from the provinces who was influenced by the work of Rousseau. And Robespierre is really going to fire up people's anger during the Revolution. With the French economy still in crisis and Paris suffering from inflation, high unemployment, and scarcity, so they can't get what they need, Robespierre used the popular press and political clubs to forge an alliance with the volatile Parisian working class. His growing strength in the streets allowed him to purge the National Convention of his enemies and to reconstruct the government. Executive power was placed in the hands of the newly formed Committee of Public Safety, which created special courts to seek out and punish domestic enemies. So this Committee of Safety is not safe for you if you are considered an enemy. Among the groups that lost ground were the active feminists of the Parisian middle class and the working class women who had sought the right to bear arms in defense of the revolution. These women had provided decisive leadership at crucial times, helping propel the revolution forward toward a widening suffrage and more democratic structure. Armed women had actively participated in every confrontation with conservative forces. It is ironic that the National Convention, the Revolutionary era's most radical legislative body, one elected by universal male suffrage, male voters, chose to repress the militant feminist forces that had prepared the ground for its creation. So these men come in and basically tell the women, we don't need your help anymore. You're out of here. Faced with that rebellion in the provinces and foreign invasion, Robespierre and his allies unleashed a period of repression called the Reign of Terror from 1793 to 1794. It's only a year long, but it lives up to its name. During the terror, approximately 40,000 people were executed or died in prison. Another 300,000 were thrown into prison. New actions against the clergy were also approved, including the provocative measure of forcing priests to marry. Oof, that's a Catholic, no. Even the time was subject to revolutionary change. A new Republican calendar created 12 30-day months divided into 10-day weeks. Sunday, with its Christian meaning, disappeared from the calendar. By the spring of 1794, the revolution was secure from foreign and domestic enemies, but repression, now institutionalized, continued. Among the victims were some who had been Robespierre's closest political collaborators during the early stages of the Terror. So you may start out a friend and become an enemy at any point. No one is safe from the Terror. The execution of these former allies prepared the way for Robespierre's own fall by undermining the sense of invulnerability that had secured the loyalty of his remaining partisans in the National Convention. So, a sort of a sense of paranoia starts to take hold. You don't know if you're safe. You don't know if you disagree with Robespierre and his followers, if you are going to be declared an enemy, despite the fact that this whole thing is supposed to be about democracy, which is sort of the hypocrisy of the whole thing. After the French victories eliminated the immediate foreign threat, conservatives in the convention felt secure enough to vote for the arrest of Robespierre on July 27, 1794. Over the next 2 days, Robespierre and nearly 100 of his remaining allies were executed at the guillotine. Sorry, Robespierre. Have a taste of your own medicine. Purged of Robespierre's collaborators, the convention began to undo the radical reforms. It removed many of the emergency economic controls that had been holding down prices and protecting the working class. Gone also was toleration for violent popular demonstrations. When the Paris working class rose in protest in 1795, the convention approved the use of overwhelming military force. Another retreat from radical objectives was signaled when the Catholic Church was permitted to regain much of its former influence. The church's confiscated wealth, however, was not returned. A more conservative constitution was also ratified. It protected property, established a voting process that reduced the power of the masses, and created a new executive authority called the Directory. Once installed in power, however, the Directory proved unable to end foreign wars or solve domestic economic problems. So this executive level position that they put in place does not solve their economic issues or their military conflicts. After losing the election of 1797, the Directory suspended the results. The Republican phase of the revolution was clearly dead. Legitimacy was now based on coercive power rather than elections. Somebody is weak government, so somebody has got the opportunity to step in and take control, which is what happens when a government gets weak. 2 years later, Napoleon Bonaparte, a brilliant young general in the French army, seized power. Just as the American and French revolutions had been the start of modern democratic tradition, the military intervention that brought Napoleon to power in 1799 marked the advent of another modern form of government, popular authoritarianism. So France has been a mess at this point for a good long time, and Napoleon, with the help of the military, seizes power, but the people consent to be governed because at this point they just need somebody to clean up their mess. The American and French revolutions had resulted in part from conflicts over representation. If the people were sovereign, what institution best expressed the popular will? So if the idea is that they want a representative government, how do you make sure that that government actually represents everyone? And in France, they weren't able to accomplish that through revolution. In the United States, the answer was to expand the electorate and institute representative government. So they gave more people the ability to vote, and they broke the government into 3 branches, with the legislative representative branch being broken into two separate pieces. The French Revolution had taken a different direction with the Reign of Terror. Not exactly democratic, cutting off heads. Interventions on the floor of the National Convention by market women and soldiers, the presence of common people at revolutionary tribunals and public executions, and expanded military service were all forms of political communication that satisfied, although temporarily, the French people's desire to influence their government. So the French weren't so much concerned about long-term representation as they were about expressing how unhappy they were with their current situation. Napoleon tamed these forms of political expression to organize Europe's first popular dictatorship. He succeeded because his military reputation promised order to a society exhausted by a decade of crisis, turmoil, and bloodshed. People just wanted order. Tell us what to do. Just make it better. In contrast to the National Convention, Napoleon proved capable of realizing France's dream of dominating Europe and providing effective protection for persons and property at home. Negotiations with the Catholic Church led to the Concordat of 1801. This agreement gave French Catholics the right to freely practice religion, and it recognized the French government's authority to nominate bishops and retain priests on the state payroll. In his comprehensive rewriting of French law, the Civil Code of 1804, Napoleon won the support of the peasantry and of the middle class by asserting two basic principles inherited from the moderate first stage of the French Revolution: equality in the law and protection of property. Even some members of the nobility became supporters of Napoleon after Napoleon declared himself emperor and France an empire in 1804. However, the discrimination against women that had begun during the Terror was extended by the Napoleonic Civil Code. Women were denied basic political rights and were able to participate in the economy only with the guidance and supervision of their fathers and husbands. So you see the rights of women taking even another step back. While providing personal security, the Napoleonic system denied or restricted many individual rights. So this is not the democracy that was the original intent of the revolution. It is a restriction of rights, but it brings order. So some see that as acceptable. Free speech and free expression were limited. Can't have that in a dictatorship. Criticism of the government, viewed as subversive, was proscribed, and most opposition newspapers disappeared. You cannot talk bad about the government. You cannot undermine the government, because that does not help maintain order. Spies and informers directed by the Minister of Police enforced these limits to political freedom. Thousands of the regime's enemies and critics were questioned or detained in the name of domestic tranquility. Keep the peace by quieting anyone who questions authority. Ultimately, the Napoleonic system depended on the success of French arms and French diplomacy. From Napoleon's assumption of power until his fall, no single European state could defeat the French military. Even powerful alliances like that of Austria and Prussia were brushed aside with humiliating defeats and forced to become allies of France. He built himself one heck of a military. Only Britain, protected by its powerful navy, remained able to thwart Napoleon's plans to dominate Europe. His effort to mobilize forces for an invasion of Britain failed in late 1805, when the British Navy defeated the French and allied Spanish fleets off the coast of Spain at the Battle of Trafalgar. Desiring to extend French power again to the Americas, Napoleon invaded Portugal in 1807 and Spain in 1808. If you win those countries over, you win their colonies. French armies soon became tied down in a costly conflict with Spanish and Portuguese patriots, who had forged an alliance with the only available European power, Great Britain. Frustrated by the events on the Iberian Peninsula and faced with a faltering economy, Napoleon made the fateful decision to invade Russia. Oh no. Can't afford that. In June 1812, Napoleon began his campaign with the largest army ever assembled in Europe, approximately 600,000 men. After fighting an inconclusive battle in Borodino, Napoleon pressed on to Moscow. 5 weeks after occupying Moscow, he was forced to retreat by Russian patriots who set the city on fire and by approaching armies. He ordered a retreat, but the brutal Russian weather and attacks by Russian forces destroyed his army. The geography of Russia is fateful to the French soldiers. A broken and battered fragment of 30,000 men returned home. Remember, of 600,000, 30,000 come home to France. After the debacle in Russia, Austria and Prussia deserted Napoleon and entered an alliance with England and Russia. Unable to defend Paris, Napoleon was forced to abdicate the French throne in April of 1814. The Allies exiled Napoleon to the island of Elba off the coast of Italy and restored the French monarchy. The king's back. The next year, Napoleon escaped from Elba and returned to France, but his moment had passed. He was defeated by an Allied army at Waterloo, in Belgium, after only 100 days in power. His final exile was on the distant island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, where he died in 1821. Okay, we're going to stop there, and we will pick up next time with Revolution Spreads, Conservatives Respond. I look forward to seeing you then. Have a great day.